So in this video, I'd like to talk about texturing. So this was a request by a patron, and I thought it was actually quite a good idea, so I decided to do it. So this is my introduction to this video, and I'd specifically like to talk about texturing low poly models because that's what I'm good at. In this tutorial, I will be using Blender 2.9 with Paint.net, but any version of Blender will work, and any imaging editing program that supports layers of any kind will suffice. Now, the thing is, though, this process honestly starts way before the textures even twinkle in your eye, but to keep it general, I've decided to base this, lecture, I guess, on my 256 FES 3D model of Canti from Furikuri. In case you haven't seen Furikuri, please go see Furikuri. It's only 6 episodes. It's my favorite anime, bar none. Anyway, moving on. The reason I chose this model is because the low detail of the model itself means that almost all the detail has to come from rendering out details in the extremely low resolution texture. These are texture sizes comparable to, like, say, PlayStation 1 stuff, you know, think Mega Man Legends, right? But an even lower amount of triangles. In a slightly higher poly model, say 5,000 polygons, 5,000 triangles for a character model that I would typically do, you can model some details in, which you can then finish off with your texture using the model as a guide of sorts. But with a model like this, the detail comes entirely from your texture. So it deserves some special attention, right? Now, let's move on to the UV map. So after you've got your base model done, the first important juncture in getting a good texture done is the UV map. You need a UV map that's filled to the absolute brim. Make sure everything's packed, but maybe you have margins of 0.005, you can set it in Blender, to make sure you don't have any parts of the model sharing pixels in the texture itself. Now, the reason you want it to be filling the texture map to the absolute brim is because the more space you're using, the more pixels you'll have to give detail, right? Make special note to increase the scale of high detail parts. For example, on a human being, that might be the face, the eyes, and so on. Lower the scale on stuff that you won't see, or maybe might just literally not see at all, in which case maybe you should have deleted out of the model. But there's stuff you might want to keep, but want to have really low detail, such as the soles of shoes, which might be a single color in this case. And then try your UV out with a test texture. Blender has a feature for generating something called a color grid and a UV grid that you can see in what I'm displaying on the screen right now. So try that before we move on. Now, after the UV map is blocking colors. Color blocking, right? So what I call blocking is basically the act of coloring the bottom color, the base color of every part of the model. For Canti, that means checking out my reference and making sure everything's got its base coat, which is mostly blue in this case, or turquoise, or whatever you want to call it. Blocking is elementary, so I don't think I need to explain how that works in theory, but you basically export your UV layout from the UV editing menu, after which you import the exported UV layout as a layer in your favorite art program. Well, I wouldn't say Paint.net is my favorite art program, but it's an art program. And the background layer as your base layer. Blocking will happen on your base layer, right? So you've got your color layer, you've got your UV layer. That's it so far. After blocking is done, we move on to shading. I'd suggest blocking everything before you start shading, and then doing shading and detailing on a per part basis. So, okay, so now we get to the interesting parts, right? Shading and shadows. Since I just said we're doing this at a per part basis, for us, that means we'll start at the bottom. So I'm going to start with shading some feet and some legs. For this treatise, which is what I'm calling these treatises, I'll focus mostly on the lower leg and thighs because I think some interesting stuff is happening there, which you can see in this image that I'm on the screen right now. So key here is working in layers, not like actual layers, like art program layers, although that's not a bad plan, I'll talk about that in a second, but imagined layers. So key layers here being the concept that you are mixing colors to get your final result, right? And you need to blend each new layer with the previous ones and thus plan for your result ahead of time. Now, moving back to, like, quote unquote actual layers. When doing this with actual layers, I suggest separating each new color or tint into a new layer with the normal blend mode, or whatever the equivalent is in your art program. I personally don't use layers in my work, but I don't necessarily think that you shouldn't. I think you should. For example, the base layer, like art program layer, would be background, the blocking coat, like just the blue, and then on top of that would be a lighter one that mixes with the bottom one, and on top of that would be the detail one, etc., etc., etc. Anyway, Before adding any shading, you should pick a point from which the imagined light source is coming, right? Because shading depends on a light source, and you have to pick a light source, and you have to be consistent with that light source, because I think that's one of the biggest beginner mistakes, is to not be consistent with your light source. That's where, I guess, pillow shading comes from. That's just not thinking about the light source and just putting shiny bits on where your brain thinks, it's probably there. And it doesn't work that way. Pick a light source and stick with it. I recommend a neutral position or positions, such as in front of and above the character, and another one directly above and also behind the character. So that only, I guess, the sides and stuff in between will be dark. So here we start with the block layer and then take out a light and soft brush to add the layer of matte-ish shininess to the leg, in my case, because this is sort of brushed metal plastic stuff. Another way to think about it is like, like this. The diagram that's on screen right now, you can see the lighting and aimed at a schematic version of the leg. The cones are light casting objects, and the shape in the middle is the leg as seen from above. I've made notches of color to show what color each part would have, considering the intensity of the light that's reflecting off of that part of the model. Because obviously, the farther away you get from a light source, the less intense the light's going to be. So, we then add the dark parts of the shading, where our imagined light source isn't hitting, and drop shadows. We add drop shadows from other objects on the character itself that may affect the shading. For example, the inner side of a leg, when you get near the crotch area, of course, the crotch and the hip is casting a shadow on the inside of the leg, right? And then the rest of the leg, going downwards, will just be darker by virtue of being away from the light source. In our case, the legs drop shadow on the feet is another example. They have a massive effect on the believability of the space and volume of any given object, right? Drop shadows. Now, we can move on to the most fun part now, which is detailing. So again, we're going to talk about the legs, but this time on the knee and the back of the knee. The back of the knee pit? Is that a word? So, now that we've shaded everything on a separate layer that we won't be touching anymore, aka the shading layer, we start adding details on top of that. Now, some of those details may carry their own shading, which we will just layer on top and it'll probably look alright. But we first start by simply sketching them out. So for this knee, we simply draw the line where the parts are separated, roughly. After which we clean them up on the sides by erasing the corners here and there. And again, I use a pretty soft brush for this, to make it blend a bit more nicely with the background layer, so the shading layer and the blocking layer. After which you introduce the volume of the form of the knee pad by adding some shading there. Now, an important thing regarding panel lines, which is, those dark lines that separate the quote-unquote panels that make up the leg, the knee pad, etc., is that they can't just be one color. You can't just put a black line and call it a day. It can't just be one line. Unless you literally have no more space in the texture because you're doing something really low res, you should always try to imply a little bit more about the shape than one pixel thick line. In the case of this knee, you should add a little bit of light coloring below the knee to imply the curvature of the material there, that it's curving upwards until it goes into a steep incline cliff, which is then the dark line, and then it comes back upwards to be the other side of the panel. Now, another example would be this. After the knee, you also have the arm, and now we can continue this process throughout the entire model, with special attention put on focal points in the character's design, right? So for Canti, that would be the head and the chest. For your favorite anime girl that you're probably modeling, because you're not modeling a robot, are you? It would be probably the face, the hair, maybe shirt details, stuff like that. So make sure to put extra time into that, because you cannot put that much time into everything, obviously, or else it's going to take forever. But put extra time in the parts that your eyes are naturally pulled to. Now we get to the closing thoughts of this little treatise. I know it's not quite a tutorial per se, because, or maybe it is, it depends on your definition of tutorial, but I prefer to kind of talk about, like, how you can kind of get to the results that I get to on your own art, rather than tell you exactly what to do. Because if you want someone to tell you exactly what to do, you could just go to school. Or you could just, do one of those million Blender donut tutorials, right? So looking at the script I've written here and that I'm now voice acting, is this voice acting? I feel like I've only really touched upon the basics of how I paint my models though. Like, there's no way I was going to be explaining everything that goes on in my brain in such a short kind of amount of time. And really, it's always going to be a case-by-case thing where even for me, I will think of a new technique on the spot to try to express some kind of detail that I've never had to express before in another art piece. So there's no way I can anticipate all of that. So with that said, you know, please ask me questions if you're stuck on a particular model or don't know how to make a thing look good, or if you just want feedback in general. Now, another tip I forgot to work into the material here, like into the script above, is that having some real good reference, like photos, drawings, or paintings to color pick from is ideal. So for example, for my Canti 3D model, I actually color picked from a figure, the Riobot figure, which I would really like to own. So if any of you guys is really rich, my birthday's coming up. But jokes aside, like, you should always have good reference. And this goes for anatomy, this goes for everything. This also goes for coloring. It's not, you know, don't try to just do it by yourself. Just try to find good reference. Now, there may be a case that there, you know, is no good reference for what you're working on. For example, because you're doing something original. Good for you, by the way. So just find a picture or reference of the same material that might not be the exact same shape, but if it's like a sort of the same shape and sort of the same material, then you can just recolor that and then color pick from that, right? Or you can at least see the relationship between the parts that the light is hitting and the parts that the light isn't hitting, but always have some kind of reference in mind or in view. Just going to town with the basic paint palette is probably not going to do much for you. You know, it's not going to work for you. With all that said, let me know what you thought of the video down below, or on Patreon, or on my Discord through discord.heatphoenix.net, which is on screen at the bottom right now. I'll see you guys again next time. New topic. I'm not sure what that's going to be. You can just request it if you'd like. Bye-bye.